So I just spent the last hour debugging my code. What the heck? So I discovered a bug that has apparently been in my code for all of last week and now part of this week. It turns out that I was not referencing things right when I was drawing. So this had me all sorts of confused. Angles were off, lines were drawn weird, and as you'd rotate around the enemy, lines might be longer or shorter than they should be. And I couldn't figure out for the life of me what was going on. I got to the point where I was looking at the magnitude every single frame to see if there was a change in what the length of the line should be. Turns out there wasn't. I just didn't know how to draw things. Which is kind of like real life. I don't know how to draw very well. So when you draw in a script, that drawing is relative to whatever node your script is attached to. So in my case, that happens to be the kinematic body 2D of my enemy. Which is the enemy of my friend? Either way, so that's where the problem stemmed from. It turns out when I drew the point where the line starts, I did that correctly. I said, hey, start from my collision shape position. And then I was like, go to my velocity. Wherever that's supposed to be. Problem is velocity is relative to the kinematic body 2D's position and not the collision shape's position. Which is relative to the kinematic body 2D's. There's a lot of weird things that you have to keep track of when you're writing code. This is one of them. I hate it, but I fixed it. So, this whole time I might as well have been coding with these gloves on because, yeah, I wasted a lot of time. And if I'm typing with these, I'd be wasting a lot of time. Oh no. It doesn't want to come off. That's better. Don't judge me. Yes, you can have my glove. Do you want it? Now that my gloves are off, the gloves are off. So, to make matters worse, I got myself all confused as to what coordinate space raycasts were supposed to be in. Global? Local? Something else? Who knows? Well, it turns out that if you read the actual raycasting tutorial, it tells you that it's supposed to be in global space. But if you're like me and you jump over it and you go right into the low-level intersect ray documentation, you'll find that it has a parameter from or to. Well, from and to. And that defines where your array starts and where it ends. Unfortunately, from and to aren't very descriptive if you don't know what coordinate space it's in. Is it relative to the script? Nope. Turns out it's world space or global space. So if you have to use raycasts in the future, just remember global space. This is something that I've noticed is a bit of a problem with the Godot documentation in general. You've got a lot of parameters that are named quite vague for what they should be. So you can read the documentation right inside of Godot. The problem is you can't read the tutorials such as raycasting right inside of Godot. Really how this documentation should be written is the parameters should be like global from and global to, not just from or to. Or, you know, even in the documentation itself, just write, hey, this is going to be a global coordinate system. I don't know. So, just something to keep in mind. So I kind of went a little Captain Ahab this week with my collision avoidance work. I ended up spending way more time than I really wanted to on collision avoidance work this week. I'm pretty sure I told myself at one point that I was not going to work on it, and then I continued to work on it. I've stopped that. No more collision or obstacle avoidance work. I'm done with it. I don't care. I don't need it. No more obstacles in the middle of the screen. The ones I was testing with were too large to begin with, and having obstacles in the middle of a brawler doesn't super enhance the experience, I don't think. It'll just make it a pain in the neck to navigate around. So, the question is, what did I actually get done this week? Well, I worked on a bunch of collision avoidance stuff that didn't end up making the cut. Part of it was taking the collision shapes and mapping it out to points so that the player could navigate around the points. So if you imagine a rectangle, or I could show you, you see the rectangle's now got points around it, and so does the circle. And those are points that the player can navigate around to. And it sort of worked, but the problem is that I would have to keep track of where the player has been in order to move them to the next point in their path. Keep in mind that when the enemy collided with the object, it would also keep track of where the player was, so that it would know what point was closest to the player, what point was closest to the enemy. I ended up scrapping this because it seemed maybe a bit too complicated. I was gonna have to do a bunch of weird stuff to make it to work, and it just wasn't that worth it in the end. I think I found a better solution that will end up saving tons of time and effort in the event that there are even any obstacles to collide with. So after I scrapped that, I decided to take a break for a while and play some video games. While I was doing that, I came to the conclusion that, hey, if I get stuck behind an obstacle as an enemy, provided if I do have any obstacles, I can just choose to launch myself in some direction that is not the current direction I'm going. And there's actually a nice little test move function on a kinematic body that you can do this with, where it will see if it can actually go that path, whatever path that is you want to go, without colliding into something. And I did make a little test example. It seems like it'll work pretty good for when I need to do that, with some minor tweaking or rewrite, but it seems promising. So like I said, I went Captain Ahab. Then after I did that, I decided I was done with it. I ripped all that code out, and I refactored a good portion of the code in the project. I went through the Godot official style guidelines and started to refactor my code based on that. And it honestly looks a lot nicer now, and it's a lot easier to read. So after I reorganized myself to get myself back on track, I decided that, hey, maybe I should actually make it look like something's going on here. And I decided to drag my sword asset into the scene and see what I could do with that. I decided to make my sword its own scene. That way down the road I can have multiple weapons, so I can swap between them based on what the player wants to use. So I'm adding these weapons dynamically in the code. You don't use the add child function, and instead you use the add child node below, where you specify the node you want to put it below. I found that for some reason the animation didn't want to animate, so you'd be walking around and your sword would just be sticking straight flat off your body instead of actually, like, you know, the super exaggerated sword movement that I have now. I'm assuming that's an engine bug. Like, that seems like that shouldn't happen, but, you know, whatever. It's easy enough to just say, hey, this is the node I want to attach the weapon to, and be done with it. And that's what I did. And I actually really like the result. It looks pretty cool right now. It's important to note that instead of directly attaching the weapon to the right arm, I created a weapon slot node underneath of the right arm. That way I could choose exactly where the position of the weapon was going to be. And it seemed to work out really, really well, because before I did that I had trouble adjusting the weapon to its position on the arm, and if I had a different weapon in the future that was shaped a little differently, the offset would be weird. So this seemed to make it work really well. Now what I'm hoping to do for next week is make some more animations and or make this weapon do something. So it might be a mixture of both. Also working on some more official art, so we'll see where that gets us. Alright, so I made an executive decision. I'm going to cut this video short so that I can shift the day that I work on editing this for next week. That way I can get this out earlier in the week, and I can work on more cool stuff. Last week I didn't get to work on as much stuff as I wanted to because I was busy editing the video. Hopefully this will allow me to make future videos more interesting. So I'm cutting this week short and we're not getting as much done as I had hoped, but you know, we'll see you guys next week.